Hi everyone, my name is Matteo Miele. I am an affiliated assistant professor at the Center for Southeast Asian Studies of Kyoto University. The title of my presentation is Sino Afghan Relations in 1942, the Weak British Mediation. This presentation is given at the National and International Conference Liberal Arts of the Future, Changes and Challenges in Research and Pedagogy, organized by the Faculty of Liberal Arts at Thammasat University on the 26th and 27th of July 2022. So, one of my research interests is the international relations of the Republic of China. Currently, I am studying the relations between China and the countries of the Sadabad Pact. As you know, the Sadabad Pact was a non-aggression agreement signed in 1937 by four Middle Eastern countries. These four Middle Eastern countries were Persia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Turkey. Why this interest in these countries, as well as in other Middle Eastern countries by the Republic of China during the conflict? We can give at least a couple of reasons. One reason was certainly the question of extraterritoriality. Already in 1920, as well highlighted by Li Chiao-chen, one of the main reasons behind the Sino-Persian Treaty was the exclusion of the privilege of extraterritoriality in that document, after years of what nationalist and communist historiography have defined as unequal treaties. In the early 1940s, the abolition of this privilege was being negotiated with the United States and Great Britain. As we know, extraterritoriality was then abolished in 1943. The Republic of China was therefore trying to weave a Middle Eastern diplomatic network also to limit Japanese action in the area. Indeed, in February 1942, a treaty was signed with Iraq. In May 1942, after the Anglo-Soviet invasion and especially after the expulsion of Japanese diplomats, a Chinese minister was sent to Tehran. This issue was partly addressed in a paper of mine published in 2021 in the Thai Journal of East Asian Studies that also deals with the issue of extraterritoriality. What about Afghanistan? Well, a first attempt was made with the Afghans as early as 1939. With an unofficial mission of Chinese Muslims in Kabul. A new attempt is put in place in 1942, but a treaty will not be signed until 1944. This presentation, therefore, focuses on the attempt of 1942 and on one of the reasons of the temporary failure. The Chinese attempt, it must be said, was somewhat mirroring the attempt made by the Afghans some 20 years earlier. At that time, it was the Afghans who needed international recognition. This was after the Third Anglo-Afghan War of 1919, when, as you know, the Afghans defeated the British, and therefore this is the end of the British protectorate over Afghanistan, and therefore the Afghan government was looking for international recognition, international relations. They wanted to establish a diplomatic network. Now, in 1942, it was the Chinese government who sought an agreement with Kabul. The problem was that Afghanistan, rather the royal Afghan family, was crossed by two factions. One faction was pro-allies, while the other faction was pro-Axis. Anyway, 1942 was defined by Horner as the decisive year on this matter. However, China will only come to sign a treaty in 1944. The Chinese, in these relations with the countries of the Middle East, sought the mediation of the British. In the specific case of Afghanistan, in February 1942, Chiang Peng-chung, who was the Chinese minister in Ankara, tried to contact the Afghan minister in the Turkish capital, but he tried to contact him through the British, in particular through the British ambassador. In fact, this is a letter written by the British ambassador, sent to the Foreign Office, dated February 23rd, 1942. And as you see here, he says that Chinese minister went on to say that his policy is to establish diplomatic relations with all independent countries in the Near and Middle East threatened by Axis aggression. And then with Turkey and Iraq, a start had been made. With Persia, conversations had been concluded for an eventual exchange of ministers. But to Afghanistan, he attached particular importance as Japan was still represented in Kabul. Its object, the strengthening of morale in countries mentioned, had recently been illustrated in another form by visit of Chiang Kai-shek to India and his conversations with nationalist leaders. Now, this is very interesting. It was, however, a policy that could not bear fruit without support of His Majesty's government, which he much hoped would be forthcoming. This text highlights Chinese interest in the matter and also the weight that the British must have had in the negotiations. Anyway, the English approach during 1942 was, however, at least we can define it contradictory. At first, in fact, the Foreign Office was in favor of this Sino Afghan rapprochement. This text is taken from a minute by Sir John Brennan of the Eastern Department and former British consul in Shanghai. As you can see, it dates back to a few days after the Nachbul Hagessen's letter. The Foreign Office's idea was to be able to use the Chinese to build a Pan-Asian narrative against the Japanese Pan-Asian narrative. It was obviously difficult for the British to counter the Japanese on the propaganda field. The documents of the National Archives actually testify to several British interventions in the following months on the Afghan authorities that now there is no time to analyze carefully. However, these attempts did not convince the Afghans to sign a treaty with the Chinese. So as we see, the interest was for the British was they wanted to build another narrative against the Japanese narrative. Anyway, a few months later, in September, as seen in this other document, still this document is another document written by the same person, by Sir John Brennan. The Foreign Office realized the impossibility of that position. Building a Chinese Pan-Asian narrative that did not harm British interests was certainly, can find it, naive. Indeed, Chinese propaganda was a serious threat to the empire. And in fact, you see, he writes that our reasons for supporting China's attempt to establish a legation at Kabul were a general wish to be friendly to China as an ally, and B, the hope that a Chinese representative would help to counter Japanese pan-Asiatic propaganda in an Asiatic country. The India office tells us that there is not much virtue in B, while China's friendliness to us as an ally has not been remarkable in recent months. The situation has changed since we first took up China's case at Kabul. We have had to suffer Chinese intervention in India on the side of Congress, a revival of Chinese claims to dictate to Tibet, and the beginnings of a Chinese pan-Asian doctrine hostile to our position in Burma, Malaya, and South Seas. And then Brennan writes that I'm not convinced, therefore, of the wisdom of going out of our way to establish Chinese influence in Afghanistan against the wishes of the Chinese government. We might be sorry for it later on. We have already done all that is necessary from the point of view of courtesy to an ally, and I think we might leave it at that. Therefore, in October, the Foreign Office decides to no longer support the Chinese attempt. And this is a letter from the Foreign Office to the British ambassador to Persia, Sir Richard Bullard. And in fact, as you can see at the end of this text, accordingly, we do not propose to reopen the matter with the Afghans for the present. And if your Chinese colleague should revert to the matter, you will no doubt find some suitable excuse for putting him off. In conclusion, it should be noted that this presentation is focused on a specific and difficult phase of the Sino Afghan negotiations, which will then lead anyway to the signing of a treaty. Further research should be conducted for the months and the years following the period analyzed to define a complete picture of the British role and of the whole question. Thank you very much for your kind attention.